The thing that really stuck with me about talking to strangers was this conclusion that humans are not we're not very good at knowing when another person is lying. When I interview FBI agents and things like that, if they specialize in body language or all of these different sorts of nonverbal communication, even they will say, yeah, it's kind of a coin flip on whether or not I know somebody is lying, unless I've spoken to them for like an hour and a half. And then I start to get good at catching them in lies. But these are the people who are supposed to be best at it. And even they will then admit, yeah, right off the bat, I just can't tell. Um, we like to think our intuition is correct and that our judgments mean something, but it just seems like in many contexts, they overwhelmingly do not. Kick it
Well,
off.
I think it's important to make a distinction between the kinds of intuitions that are educatable and the kinds that are not. So, if you are in a situation where, if you're a brain surgeon and you're doing brain surgeries over the course of 20 years, and you're exposed to thousands of cases, and you're getting immediate feedback on the quality of your judgments, you're going to get better. There's no question about that. We know we have reams of evidence about. So, we've all had. I sent a photograph of my daughter's eye to my cousin, who's a academic ophthalmologist. He was like, "Oh, she's got this." He answered instantly, right? So, in his case, his snap judgments are fantastic, but there when we get into areas like assessing other people or guessing what someone else is thinking, there's no feedback loop. I don't get a fact check if I think, "Oh, Jordan's really annoyed with me right now." There's no way for me to fact check that, right? I can't. I may be looking at some cues and drawing a conclusion, but that process doesn't get improved by you telling me definitively whether I'm right or wrong. So that's a quality of intuition that never really improves. It just kind of we're always kind of stabbing in the dark, and it's particularly difficult when we're dealing with these kinds of guessing someone's internal state. That it's not clear. Like you mentioned that sometimes these FBI agents say, "Well, after an hour and a half, I'm getting better at it." The data would say that they're fooling themselves.
Mhm.
They're not getting better. We're all
Yeah,
bad.
that does sort of check out. Joe Navarro, who sort of pioneered their behavioral analysis program, which is in some ways supposed to be about not lie detection, but recruiting spies and counterintelligence and things like that. Even he said you really just can't tell. Like you can throw these body language things in, but unless you know your target super well, like you've been observing them for a really long time and you've got some sort of way, what do you call it, a baseline to see their actions, and you've been doing this for 10 or 20 years in the FBI, then you have a better than 50-50 chance of guessing what they're doing. But so he sort of uses that example to say, so when your friend's cousin who's been watching a bunch of YouTube videos says, aha, he's lying because his foot's pointed towards the door and then he looked down when he said it's just complete nonsense and probably even more wrong than if they just flipped a coin.
Yeah, it's hocus pocus.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for people to accept that fact. I think sometimes. I mean, we are powerfully invested in the value of our impressions and first impressions, and also because of what I said, that in certain instances our first impressions are really useful. That we do, we make judgments about whether we like someone very quickly. And
Mhm.
those tend to be quite, they're highly predictive of whether we'll end up liking them. So, we make very rapid judgments of whether we're romantically attracted to somebody. And that again is something that stands up over time. So it's like, it's just difficult to accept the fact that a faculty that can be highly robust in one context is not in another.
It's funny. Of course, we can judge whether or not we think somebody is attractive or whether we like them. But then the key difference is that's about us, right? That's about my perception of you. It has really almost nothing to do with the other person. Sure, it has to do with the way they strike us at one point. But we as humans tend to conflate what we decide someone is versus what they actually are. And it's almost like, even though I can explain that difference in one sentence or two sentences, it my whole life I'm going to be fighting myself to believe that those two things are different intuitively. which is ridiculous.
What's even more kind of perverse is in every other realm of our existence, we are legitimately getting better, right? So our technology is getting better, our knowledge is getting better, everything is getting better.
Mhm.
As human beings, we're still stuck with the same shortcomings as
Yeah.
we had 1,000 years ago. It's pretty humbling.
It's humbling and it's almost frustrating because for those of us that like to be working on skills and working on ourselves, I mean, I spent years working on trying to tell what somebody's internal state was. Are they attracted? Are they lying about it? And then to just find out at the end of it all that I was really just guessing and then convincing myself that I was right. It's so profoundly disappointing in so many ways.
Yeah, but also, but the big argument of talking to strangers is that in the end, what we perceive as a failing,
Mhm,
our inability to read other people's internal states, is actually the one of the best things that human beings have going for us. That the reason we do that is that we are wired, we're trusting engines. We're
mhm,
wired basically to believe people and trust them. And it's because of that that we have been able to do virtually every important thing that we've done as a species, right? The life is if you don't have a default to truth, if you don't implicitly trust others, you can't do anything.
mhm.
Can't participate in the world, can't walk down the street, can't send your kids to school. We've seen, how haywire our society goes when even for a moment we abandon that predisposition towards truth.
Yeah, that's true. I think before when I read about truth default theory and when I read Talking to Strangers, it was like the abstract person that maybe doesn't default by default trust others. Now all you have to do is look online or even in your own family at Thanksgiving and like crazy Uncle Frank is the guy who won't use credit cards because they're tracking you, doesn't want a cell phone, won't use the internet, everything. And his life is dysfunctional, right? He can't actually exist in the modern world or in even in the not modern world because everybody's out to get him. As important as crazy Uncle Frank is, right, with his 640 credit score, everyone's out to get him, and it's really unbelievable. You have to sort of start by believing others, and then and if we only in the face of really overwhelming evidence do we kind of change our mind, right?
Exactly. That's the great, you know, discovery of when I delved into the research for talking to strangers, that you abandon your position, your default position that someone's telling you the truth, um, only when the evidence becomes impossible to deny. So you rarely ever know you're being lied to in a moment because you don't have enough evidence yet. The most common pathway to figuring out that you've been lied to is uh, that you're lied to 8 times, and then finally you find the credit card receipt in your partner's wallet, and you realize, oh, they absolutely were in Albuquerque when they said they were in Chicago, right? The it's not something that you would have guessed, and you can guess in the moment. It's just not the way as human beings that we're wired.
Right. So doubts only these kinds of doubts only trigger disbelief when we just cannot explain them away. So unfortunately, right, smart people who are good at rationalizing things, we will doubt someone and then we will explain it away. And I spent a long time doing that with, let's say, working, having business partners that are scammers or addicts or whatever it is that are lying habitually to me. And I just started doing more and more mental gymnastics. And then one day it's just like, wait a minute, what am I doing? This is not helping me navigate this situation. I'm just doing their work for them. And like to your example, someone's cheating in a relationship, and later when they're caught, you say to yourself, "How could I have been so stupid? The signs were all there." And it's the answer is actually you weren't stupid, you were smart. You just kept rationalizing their behavior for them because you're intelligent enough of a creature to do that. And that's probably one reason why us humans are so easily duped, right?
Yeah. It's funny. Tim Levine, who's the psychologist whose work I relied on for that part of talking to strangers, he's so, the first time I ran across so all these ideas are really things that he and a couple of other of his
Hmm.
colleagues pioneered. This idea that, psychologists have been struggling for generations to try and figure out why are human beings so bad at detecting truth and lies. And there was a million explanations that have been floated, and um, it was really Tim Levine who comes along and says, it's first of all, no one's good at it. The previous theory had been, oh, it's a set of techniques that if we only
Mhm.
learn the set of techniques, then we can all get good. And he's like, no, 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 no one's good, and no one's good for a good reason. That's really his contribution. I mean, he made enormous contributions to this field, but I remember reading when I read Tim Levine's work for the first time. It was before I even had decided to write a book. This book, um, it just was like it kind of opened my eyes. I was like, oh my god, this resolves so many unanswered questions I'd had about why on earth would we be bad at something? You would have thought evolution would have selected out the people who were good at telling truth from falsity, right? But
Mhm.
Tim's point is actually no. Evolution would favors those who trust other people. Evolution favors the people who will occasionally be duped, because the 98% of time when they're not duped and their trust is rewarded puts them so far ahead of the game that they're the ones who win out in the end.
Oh, I see. Right, because getting duped occasionally is not enough to take down the fact that 1,500 people can work together and build a giant, I don't know, castle in the middle of indefensible territory. And yeah.
Because one of his sort of he has all these kind of propositions that he proved one, and one of his central propositions is that almost first of all, lying is a lot less frequent than we think. Consequential lies. So white lies, no, people white lie all the time, but a white lie is not a white lie is a lie that you tell in order to preserve the social fabric. It is actually a lie that is told in the interest of preserving trust, right? But real lies, lies that are serious attempts to, his point is, first of all, they're rare. And secondly, only a small number of people tell those kinds of lies with any frequency. So there's a little tiny pool of liars in the world. And then everyone else is basically in trusting mode. And that means that your odds are, it's why the odds favor the trusters, because you will, sure, if you invest all your life, there's a chance you might run into Bernie Madoff. But 99.9% of investors never run into Bernie Madoff. And, you know, fund their retirement because they trust the people who take their money to do something productive with it. And that's a really healthy thing in society.
It also explains why there are these when we see the bad examples, right? The Dr. Larry Nasser, for people who don't know, this is like a doctor for the USA gymnastics team and over at Michigan State who abused, was it hundreds or was it actually thousands? I guess they maybe don't even know of young women.
Many women have
And
come forward here.
many, many. And Rachel Denhollander, who was on the show, episode 332, she came out and finally sort of blew the lid off this whole thing, and now he's in prison for life. And people said, I can't believe that this happened. But if you think about truth default theory, it explains a lot of why something like this can happen. Yes, there was a cover up, and there's other people who are um, culpable in this who said, oh, they're just making this up. But default truth biases us in favor of the maybe the most likely information and not the most accurate, right? So the most likely information is this weird nerdy doctor guy is probably fine because most people are.
Most nerdy people are not child molesters.
Right.
Most child molesters are actually, it's an incredibly rare, active, aggressive child molesters are incredibly rare. If your daughter is being treated by someone who seems a little weird, the odds are he's actually not a child molester,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Um, so people, that was, you're right. People take the likeliest interpretation, which is usually works, and sadly in that case did not. And I did a chapter on that because I thought some of the stories are astonishing. I mean,
Really.
there would be mothers in the room when Nasser was abusing their children, and they couldn't see it, not because they were inattentive or, but just that as human beings we have difficulty seeing something that is that kind of statistically and morally unlikely.
And of course, that was what his whole thing was. Is he'd be like, this is gonna twinge a little because it's your, I don't know, pelvic floor something something, and he's got a blanket over them, and the girl winces, and the mom's like, oh, it's okay, honey, right? And it's just that made it even worse, right? Because one interpretation is, hey, he's being a good doctor, he's doing some stuff that I don't fully understand. The other interpretation is this is a pedophilic monster who is doing this right in front of mom and dad and been doing it for decades and no one said anything. And it's just like, well, what are the odds of that, to be fair?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
No, it's a kind of the whole thing is, uh,
Skeevy.
it is
Yeah.
a little bit.
Well, the reason this stuff is so relevant right now is that there are dramatic, and in this case, literally dramatic implications of this for our modern world where people are forming these judgments constantly about tons of people online, on TV, in person, with politicians. You see this all the time. Look at Joe Biden, looked left, he's lying. Or more likely, in the pop culture sense, there's courtroom footage, and we're all trying to decide if Johnny Depp or Amber Heard are the ones that are lying or whatever. And we're so bad at this. And yet, was that the most watched thing of the entire last couple of years, the entire pandemic potentially? I mean, that trial probably got more people watching it than the Game of Thrones seasons.
But it's proof of the point, right? The fact that the world was sort of evenly divided on pro Amber, pro Johnny.
Were they evenly divided? I don't know, man.
I
I
don't even
didn't
know.
check.
I mean, the fact that there were lots of people on both sides of that one,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was even,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the fact that there were lots of people who legitimately took one position or
Oh,
another
yeah.
of that says that these are not things that as human beings we can reach definitive answers about. I mean, all we're doing is kind of venturing an opinion based on our own highly subjective reading of the facts. I think that's why, you know, do you remember a movie years ago? There was a movie about God, what was it called? The Freedmans, capturing the Freedmans. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. What was that about, though? I do remember that. I downloaded it.
It was about a family, a father and a son who had a who were accused of being child molesters in the most kind of extravagant, exotic kind of. Um, and this was a documentary about what the father and son went through after they were accused of this. I remember, so I watched that and I was like, oh, it was these guys were innocent. This whole thing, the movie is all about the hysteria and the false charges leveled against these guys. And I was discussing the movie with a really good friend of mine, a highly intelligent person for whom I have enormous respect.
Hmm.
And he had 100% the opposite conclusion. And that was one of the first moments when I was like, oh, this is hard. It's like we watched the same movie and reached both of us had a 100% different interpretation of the filmmaker's intent.
It's interesting, right? Because, of course, you watch some documentaries and you go, they did it. Oh, now they didn't do it. Wait, nope, they did it. And that's the documentarian doing that on purpose. But if you're literally sitting there, you both finish it, and then you go, what do you think? It's obvious they're criminals, right? And the other person goes, you're joking, aren't you? That's just the same input into different, it's a different Plinko machine in your head, and it just comes out with a completely different result.
Yeah. I was the same way did you watch the original documentary, The Staircase?
A while ago, probably.
I was like, the guy's innocent. And like, you know, good friends of mine were like, the guy's guilty.
It seems dangerous that this is the outcome, right? I guess there's probably a reason that it's not, but for me, it's a little scary that we can watch Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard, and suddenly we decide. I mean, my wife, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but she would be like, "I just hope they throw the book at Amber Heard. She's the worst person ever." And I'm thinking, you really only heard a very biased testimony from Johnny Depp's lawyer. That's kind of like I'm introduce you to somebody that I absolutely hate and who I want to destroy, and you're going to form your opinion of this person based on what I tell you. And now you have to meet them and have a totally unbiased experience with them. It's impossible.
Yeah, well, you know, but if we explore these ideas too far, then popular culture, a big chunk of popular culture disappears. I mean,
Yeah.
right? An awful lot of you think about how many podcasts are about, examinations of grisly crimes,
A true crime. Yeah.
which are interesting to us for precisely this reason. That if it was an open and shut matter about whether someone was guilty or innocent or lying or telling the truth, none of these narratives would have any appeal to us. They're appealing to us precisely because of this point that we're just lost. So you really can tell a compelling story because we genuinely are in the dark.
Tell me about mismatching. I had Amanda Knox on the show, and yeah, she's quirky. She's a little she's an interesting person, and I don't know, she's just a little on a different wavelength than a lot of people. But that apparently was enough for people to say she's wily, she's unpredictable. Her emotions after the murder of her roommate in Italy didn't match up to what people expected to see. So that just must mean she's guilty, not, oh, well, she's totally detached from this and just had a different reaction than I would have. And thus, that's it. It doesn't mean anything.
So this is another, I think, really important Tim Levine idea. One of Tim's arguments is that it is not the case that all people are impossible to make sense of. He said there are people, the central problem in trying to read someone's internal states is that you make an inference about what they're thinking on the inside from the way they behave on the outside. And in some cases, that's easy. A baby, when a baby hits his head and starts to cry,
Mm,
you say the baby is sad and upset and in pain, right? And how do you reach that conclusion? By observing the fact that they're crying and they're in a state of visible discomfort. That's called matched behavior, where the external and the internal are consistent with each other, and where the internal feeling is represented in the way that we commonly understand um, internal feelings to be represented on the outside. So a matched person who's nervous sweats. A matched person who is excited, their eyes go wide and their eyebrows go up and their mouth opens, right? But there's a significant pool of people who are unmatched, whose internal states are accompanied by external states that are just kind of different. That there are some people, lots of people, who don't smile when they're happy, who don't sweat when they're nervous, and whose eyes don't go wide when they're surprised, right? They just have different manifestations. And there are some people they're uh, when they're innocent of a crime and they're being asked about it by a police officer, they get indignant and say, "How could you
hmm
accuse me?" Right? There are other people when they're innocent of a crime and they're talking to the police officer, they get really super quiet and nervous. Doesn't mean they're guilty. Just
Right.
means that Levine would say they're mismatched. They just have a set. And my feeling, I read all of these books on, the million books on Amanda Knox. And what's fascinating about is, most of them are books explaining why people think she's guilty. And what's fascinating is that 100% of, not 100%, 90% of the evidence used to accuse Amanda Knox of being a killer is about how her behavioral reactions are unusual. In
Right.
other words, it's all about the fact she's mismatched. It's like no one has any. There's no actual evidence suggesting that she just isn't that she murdered her roommate. It's just
Right.
she doesn't behave the way we expect someone who is innocent to behave, which is the flimsiest, most useless way to determine someone's guilt. It was like I was reading all those Amanda Knox books, and I was like, oh my god, this is like I want to. Can I just send everyone a copy of Tim Levine's research so they can understand this incredibly basic psychological error that they're making?
It's a shame because it essentially this has defined her life, for better for worse, and mostly for worse, because she was in an Italian prison for a couple of years or something like that. I can't remember, and she's infamous, even though she's been marked as not guilty. There's all these people. No, she got off on a technicality. I mean, the YouTube comments on episode 386 of this show, and the emails I've gotten are just, I mean, they're horrible. And it's like, even if I don't know, well, I feel bad for her, and I'm thinking, "Oh my goodness." And then people go, "You got duped. You know she did it." And it's just horrible. We judge people's honesty based on their demeanor, which is of course inaccurate. And the mismatch, that's what seems like dishonesty. So of course, when I read that, I'm like, "Oh, I mismatched." That literally explains my whole life. Um, but of course, the default to truth, which we just talked about, plus the mismatching means we get deceived really easily in theory.
Oh yeah, yeah. And they're deceived in different ways. Mismatch shows how often we think someone is guilty of something when they're actually not. They're just kind of, although it can work in the opposite direction. Of course, somebody can can have all of the appearance of innocence when in fact they're deeply guilty. It's funny though because it says what it says about us is, and it goes back to something you were saying earlier, that we're people as human beings we play the odds because in most cases people who are happy inside smile on the outside. We make that into a rule,
Right. Yeah.
as opposed to thinking of it simply as a probability. You know, it should be that if you're smiling, chances are you're happy on the outside. That's it should be as far as we go, but we don't. We want to say, you know, smiling on the outside, you are happy on the inside, which is that's the bridge too far.
There was a kid in my class growing up. I can't remember his name, but it doesn't matter. Whenever he was nervous, he would smile, and it was almost like muscle tension or something. And he would smile, and he got in trouble all the time because as soon as somebody threw a spitball at the board, the teacher would look back, and of course, the kid who did it would be like writing something on paper with a pencil because he learned how to do that after third grade. And there would be this kid just staring at the teachers and sort of like smiling, and he'd go, "You, principal's office now." And this kid got it. I mean, it was like every day. And he did do some bad things, but he always looked like he was doing bad things if you're looking for that matching. And it's unfortunate that I guess this teacher didn't know there's just no uniform way that every person expresses themselves. So it's hard to tell what's going on inside their head or in any respect.
One of the coolest things, and it's in a footnote in Talking to Strangers because I couldn't figure out how to put it in the text, but I ran across this amazing study. You remember the television show Cops?
Oh, yeah.
So Cops, is a documentary show where we see cops confronting people after a crime has been committed, and we end up knowing by the end of the show whether the person who the cops talked to was innocent or guilty of the crime. It's usually fairly obvious.
Mm.
So this psychologist did this brilliant study where he looked at hundreds of episodes of Cops, and what he was interested. So we know everyone who's talking to whether in most cases we know whether the person who's talking to the cops, like I said, is innocent or guilty. And we know other things about them as well. We know whether they're black or white or Hispanic, you know, male or female. And what he discovered was that innocent white suspects and innocent black suspects talk to the police in profoundly different ways.
Mm.
So the innocent white suspect looks the police officer in the eye and answers, truthfully and not truthfully, answers like, clearly and, straight in a straightforward manner. The innocent black suspect would be far more likely to look away, to act in a way that stereotypically we would associate with guilt. It was really interesting. And then he went down like
Mm.
5 different body language cues and showed how they differ dramatically by depending on which cultural tradition you grew up in. Same thing was true with Hispanic versus white and versus black. And it was so, I just thought, oh my God, this explains so much. That if you have white police officers who grow up in a white cultural world and are used to doing that kind of calculation based on what they've seen all around them in white culture, they're going to get people from other cultures wrong. Maybe that accounts for a part of why there are these lingering tensions between, white police officers and minority groups.
So can we get better? I mean, is there any way to get better at this? More generally, I suppose, what can people's facial cues really tell us? It seems, again, there's a lot of YouTube science on this, but it's mostly been debunked by actual scientists. Is the answer to just refrain from making judgments about other people altogether, knowing how ineffective we really are?
Well, we know there's a certain thing. One is you should probably limit the amount of data you gather in any kind of situation. So
Mhm.
Tim Levine would say, if you're trying, you're probably better off just reading the transcript of someone's remarks than actually talking to them face to face if you're trying to figure out whether they're lying or not. Because the visual stuff we're getting is just screwing us up. But by looking closely at the way people phrase things, the specificity that they use, whether there's internal contradictions in the stories they're telling. Somebody who's making something up may be more likely to contradict themselves because they're inventing a story on the fly. So you probably do a better job that way. But mostly it's about patience. It's waiting long enough so you gather enough evidence that you have something to go on. You're not reacting to some fleeting bit of body language. You're actually gathering evidence and weighing it carefully and drawing a conclusion. So the very thing that we think of as being a failing of law enforcement, that law enforcement very often takes its time, is actually its strength. We can't. It's People say, well, it took them 20 years to find Madoff. Well, it probably that's how long it takes to catch one of these people, right? You're not going to find out in 10 minutes. You're not going to meet Madoff and say, he's making it all up. It takes a while.
What would this teach us about how to behave or maybe how not to behave when we're caught up in some kind of public drama? We get an office scandal, hopefully not a crime, maybe a family dispute. To what extent do we take other people's perceptions into account when we decide how to act, or should we just not even try to do that?
Well, it says that we should be cautious about our initial impressions. We should try and verify them over time. It says that we should be forgiving, or at least we should be aware of the possibility of mismatch. So the mismatches are the things that strike us in the moment. You know, if you're really so upset, why are you looking indifferent and blank faced? If you really cared about me, you would have hugged me when I walked in the door. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
We need to be mindful of how what incredible variety there is in the way people express their feelings and their intentions. That's probably the first thing, and that's about slowing down and
Mhm.
giving people the space to get to express themselves in a way that's legible.
The thing is, after knowing all this, right, having read the book multiple times and looking at all the science and all the junk science, and like I said, deluding myself for years to think I could do one thing when I couldn't, I still wouldn't hire a babysitter for my kids without meeting them, right? And so, in your opinion, is that because I'm actually gleaning useful information about this person, or am I still just in denial and I think I can do that just like everyone else thinks they can do that?
Well, so I once had an argument with Adam Grant about this, and Adam convinced me. He was like, "Well, so the information that you gather from the body language of the babysitter, the potential babysitter, is probably not a useful guide as to whether they'll be a good babysitter. However, there are other reasons to want to meet the babysitter in person. So if I say to the babysitter, let's meet at 3:30 at my house, and the babysitter shows up at 5, I'm not hiring them, right? If they show up and there's liquor on their breath, I'm not hiring them. If they show up and they pull up in my driveway and they end up parking on the grass. They drive over a flower bed. I'm not hiring them. You know what I mean? There are other reasons
The
why you want to,
metadata.
yeah, why you want to meet them face to face. And also, you may think, what if your child is someone who, you know, uh, really enjoys being around extroverted people? Then, if you think your child will get a kick out of somebody, then you have to, a certain kind of person, then it's another good reason to want to meet them face to face. But if your intention is to figure out whether your babysitter is a duplicitous person who means you ill, you're not going to figure that out by meeting them face to face. But it's important to remember those kinds of dire, high stakes judgments are only a small portion of the reasons why we might want to meet someone, and the kind of information, the useful information we can gather from an encounter.
What did Adam Grant say about this? I'm curious. And I know it's unfair to have you characterize someone else's argument like 5 years after the fact, but I am curious.
Adam, that argument I just gave you about all the other information that's useful is
Mhm.
Adam's argument.
Oh, okay.
I'm just
Gotcha.
I'm just stealing, as I always do. I steal his ideas.
Gotcha.
I'm
Yeah.
happy to credit him, but since he's much smarter than I am, it would be foolish for me to use my own ideas when I can use his.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole basis of this show, so I totally understand. Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. It seems like all the tools we have when we talk to our friends, people we know well, they betray us when we actually talk to strangers. So, what if we have an interaction that just is especially consequential? It requires high trust. There's a strong information imbalance. Doctors, lawyers, bosses. I'm trying to think of another one, but I'm coming up blank. What tools can we take from these insights and use in these interactions?
Well, that's super interesting. And uh, so these kinds of high stakes um, encounters where we have no alternatives, right? We can't shop around. We can't. Um, that's where the problem is sort of out of our hands, and it
Hmm.
becomes a social problem. So why is it so important? For example, let's use the medical example. It's very important for the medical profession to prepare its practitioners carefully and to aggressively weed out those who are substandard. Because as patients, we have no choice but to trust whatever doctor is in front of us. So we're helpless. We are effectively helpless. Like you show up, you're in a car crash and they wheel you in to the hospital on a stretcher. You can't be grilling the ER doctor to see whether that doctor is up to snuff, right? And but versions of it, even if you're you're sitting down across from your doctor and they're talking to you about some complicated thing, their knowledge base is 1,000 times larger than yours. It's a mismatch.
Right.
So that's where social institution building is so incredibly crucial, um, and uh, that they have to kind of um, uh, allow us to trust. They have to sort of raise the kind of lower the costs of trust to be as low as possible, and reward trust with competence. And that's I would say that in the United States, in the Western world, we've done a really good job of that kind of institution building, trust build, structural trust building. I remember once talking to someone who's from a developing country, and I was talking about my native Canada, and said, and for reasons I don't understand, Canadian accountants are the envy of the world. There's something about the way accounting rules are written in Canada, and the kind of training that accountants go through, that our accounting systems work really well, and other countries covet them. They like hire Canadians to come and teach them how to do it, and and that's not because Canadians are intrinsically more trustworthy than other people. It's because it in this particular instance did a really good job of institution building, and they were that. So now trust is rewarded in that realm in Canada. That's something I think as society we need to think seriously about.
Yeah, I suppose that's part of the problem we're dealing with in the last few years here is there's a lack of trust in almost or a declining level of trust in many institutions that previously seemed unassailable. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole, without meaning to comment directly on it or take sides, the whole drama about the Supreme Court and these abortion rulings is about that the court at various times in its history, when it acts rashly, it sets in motion a kind of cycle of mistrust that undermines its very reason for existence. The court only works if we feel like we're in the hands of highly competent people who are careful and cautious and thoughtful and all those kinds of things. And when the court violates that kind of pact, we get incredibly consequential social conflicts, right? I mean, we've been fighting over this thing for 50 years.
Hmm.
It's nuts. It's like, there's got to be a better way to do it. Um, the and I think it, I you know, I, it, I, it's I think you can make the case that both the original Roe and the repudiation of Roe suffer from, regardless of the merits of them, suffer from the same flaw, and that is that the 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 court did not justify how aggressively it was it was kind of violating the contract it had with the American people.
Yeah, it's interesting because of course I read, hey, the original decision was flawed. You can look at all these essays, I suppose, by justices or by legal scholars from even 50 years ago, all the way up to right now. And then they do the same thing again. And again, like you said, regardless of what the outcome is, the fact is people were pissed off then and people were pissed off now. And it's not just because they're on the wrong side of the decision. Uh, it's because we've expected something from them and not gotten it, and that's the problem with the institution. It's like when a lawyer bullies someone, and other lawyers, we go, oh gosh, I hate when that happens because it makes us all look ridiculous and bad. Or you get some crook, right? I would imagine Bernie Madoff was not good for the investing, the financial advisor industry, or anything like that. And it's because we, as members of an institution, value that institution. And journalists right now who don't make stuff up so that they get more clicks on YouTube or Facebook are also going, "Oh, come on," when they see these headlines that are just, with each headline it's just another hammer on the chisel that's taking down the foundation of trust in media. And but at some point it becomes so problematic that the truth default theory kind of doesn't even exist anymore for a lot of people who read things in media. They'll pick up the New York Times and go, "There's nothing true in here," which is also not the case.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, thinking deeply, that was what writing Talking to Strangers did for me, is it, I'd never really sort of thought in a kind of deep way about what trust looks like, how trust behaves, how trust gets violated. And that book, just doing the research for that book, sort of brought all those issues to the fore.
How do you decide what to explore and what to study? Because there's a virtually unlimited amount of topics out there, and of course, you have a knack for picking things at least that people seem to find super interesting. Uh, I also wonder how often you start a topic and then do a deep dive, and you go, "Nah," and then that just those notes sit in a drawer for a decade.
Yeah. Uh, there's a little bit of that, although it's not, I give up on things not because I don't like them, but because I feel like the time isn't right, or I'm not sure yet what I want to do with it. So there are little kind of nuggets lying around that are just kind of waiting for a home. But I guess I'm looking for stories when I decide what I'm going to go forward with. When I think, for example, about the current season of Revisionist History, which is just about to launch. Um, I was, all of the episodes this season are about experiments. So I sort of got it in my head that we don't do enough experiments in society. I didn't understand why. There's so many things we would like to learn,
Hmm.
and the best way to learn something is to do an experiment. And yet we seem to experiment with very little. That we seem to tends to sort of do things and then after the fact kind of wonder whether they work or not, as opposed to starting by saying, let's find out whether this alternative is better than the other alternative. And I didn't understand why we were so kind of loath to. So I decided that I would do a whole season that talked about experiments to give various examples of them. And there's a really fun one there that's all about the first one of the episodes is all about the. I know this is actually answers your question. Years ago, I read in a book about Hollywood an account of the original script for the first A Star Is Born, which is made by David O. Selznick in 1937, and it would subsequently be remade three more times. Most recently with Lady Gaga, and but the original script was written by Dorothy Parker. A key scene is deleted, and deleted in a rewrite with the result that the movie goes in a dramatically different direction than it had originally been intended to go. And I read this, and years ago I read this little passage, and I thought that is so interesting. A, B, I'm not convinced the new version is better than the old version. And C, I think the world would have been quite different if the old version had been put into practice. But I had nothing to do. I sort of set that aside for, God, 6 or 7 years. And then I'm doing this season on experiments. And I think, oh, I could do a good kind of what if experiment on,
Mhm.
well, what if they hadn't deleted the scene? Now, so you asked me, how do I choose my stories? That's a great one because right away you've got a little bit of Hollywood history. You've got all the great characters. You've got archive. I mean, you can go to the David O. Selznick papers, as I did in Austin, Texas. You can find all the original scripts of A Star Is Born. You can do, so there's like cool archival stuff, great characters. There are people you can talk to today who can talk about there's all kinds of film historians and actors and whatever. And you can use movie clips. So I look for stories that have lots of dimensions. And that's a story that had, the more I thought about it, the more dimensions it seemed to have. And we ended up like, there's a whole like thing about Margaret Mitchell and Gone with the Wind, and the guy, Margaret Mitchell dies in a drunk driving crash, and we end up going to Atlanta and figuring out, it's like it just leads you. I like those kinds of stories that start small, but then you end up being led in multiple directions. That's what I'm looking for. Can the little kernel take me multiple places?
I know you love jigsaw puzzles. Tell me, is this sort of well, tell me why, and does that relate to how you create your books and your writing as well?
Yeah, it is a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Um, it's a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, the difference is, of course, a real jigsaw puzzle always has a solution.
Right. It's on the front of the box, most of the time.
So you can get there. Stories, you don't always know that the problem you're grappling with has a solution. So it's a little more of a high wire act. And it's a little more exhilarating when you figure out a solution because it wasn't predetermined the way a actual jigsaw puzzle is. But you're but they're very similar in the sense that there's a kind of satisfaction, an enormous satisfaction in putting in the final piece to the puzzle, right? And that's the satisfaction you're trying to win for your audience. You want them to feel that same way when all of the pieces of the story fall together by the end. And then if you can get them to feel like a little bit of anxiety in the first part of the story where they don't know where it's going, they don't know if you're going to pull it off, and then you pull it off and they go, oh, thank God. You know, that's what you want. That moment of the last piece, oh, the puzzle is actually going to be, completed. That's gold.
There must be a lot of times when you're writing where, when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle and it's like, "Oh, I found it." And then it's just like a millimeter off from fitting in and you just want to smash it in really hard and make it fit. That's got to be a thing that you experience a lot when you're writing because you've got this, as you said, this mental drawer full of nuggets you want to use. You're trying to make the picture complete. I would be so tempted to just smash all the pieces together. I guess that's probably why I'm not a writer.
Well, I would say uh, rather than smash the piece in, why not just acknowledge the fact that the piece doesn't fit perfectly?
Mm,
So you don't want to. This is one mistake people make in writing. You never want to. If you're going to have you have two stories that you want to tell, and you want them in the end to come together. A very common storytelling technique. Your two stories should not be identical. You shouldn't be comparing apples to apples. You actually should be comparing apples to oranges, right? The cliche is wrong. You want to compare apples to oranges. So apples and oranges have a lot in common, right? They're two fruits that you eat and that are refreshing and that sit in a bowl and are about the same size, but they are profoundly different, right? You peel one, you just bite into another one, whatever. What you want to do is compare apples and oranges. You want to compare two things that have something in common, but are different enough that the act of comparing them is interesting. So, if I said to you, I did a podcast episode. Another one of my ones was about Will and Grace,
mm.
and trying to making the argument that it's the most important sitcom of the last 75 years.
What was the premise of that again for people who don't know? It was
Will was gay, Grace was straight, and they were best friends, and they could never, as a result, could never marry. They were in love with each other, but their love was forever doomed, and so they were trapped in this kind of beautiful um, friendship, and they have two of these other friends who kind of it's a classic kind of New York City eccentric people in a New York City apartment sitcom, of which there were
Mhm.
many in the 90s. Um, but you don't want to compare. It's not interesting to compare Will and Grace to Friends,
'Cause too similar. Okay.
right? If you can, but you want to compare Will and Grace. I ended up comparing Will and Grace to Orange is the New Black.
The prison show, right? I haven't seen
Yeah,
it.
on Netflix.
Okay.
And the reason was that the a guy named David Cohan created Will and Grace, and his sister Genji created Orange is the New Black. That's really what they have in common. They don't have anything else in common. They both, except for their television shows. But using that, so that's apples and oranges. But it's actually really fun to talk about how different those two shows are, even though they come from the same family, right? um, they're both really popular and they're both really good. And they're both television shows and they're produced by brother and sister. But then that's it. Then we can go in a million directions and talk about how insanely um, that's fun, right? In a way that comparing Will and Grace to Friends would not be fun.
So the imperfect puzzle is maybe what draws the reader in. Is that kind of where you're going with this?
I think so. I think I'm always wary of too completely satisfying the audience. I want the audience to feel a little bit unsettled after they've listened to one of my stories. I don't want it to feel perfect.
I guess that makes sense and probably is what gets people talking. Actually, do you read your book's reviews ever?
Not really. I mean, my problem is early in my career, my reviews were so nasty that I just kind of stopped and realized it was kind of pointless. No, I don't really. I don't actively avoid them, but I certainly don't track them down and kind of read them, you know, quietly at night.
So the criticism of your earlier work probably hasn't necessarily shaped your more recent work if they were just sort of like hateful screed that you then stopped reading.
No, I mean, I got some considered criticism, like that I took seriously. I think that I think as I've gotten older, I've become more interested in stories that are a little more complicated. That thing I just said about imperfection and apples and oranges,
Mhm.
those are not things I would have said when I was 30. Um, so I think I have kind of my tastes have gotten a little more sophisticated, which is what happens as you get older, right? It's a very common. I'm a little bolder as well. I'm going to try more weird things now than I did when I was younger. Like last season of Revisionist History, we rewrote the ending to A Little Mermaid, and then we explained why we were rewriting it, and then we acted it out, the revised version. You know, it was totally nuts, and
Yeah.
I would never have done that when I was 30. Now I think it's hilarious, and that's the kind of I feel I'm more adventurous than I was.
Do you have any criticism of your earlier work, of any of your work actually, that you hear maybe somewhat often, even today, that you actually agree with?
Yeah, I'm going to do my first book, Tipping Point, is we're coming up on its 25th anniversary, and I'm going to do a 25th anniversary revised edition, and I'm going to go back and, in some areas, substantially rewrite. I think there's a chapter in that book on crime, which is I would never have written that today. It just is so, partly because in the 90s when I wrote that book, our understanding about crime was very different than it is now. We're much further along and I'm personally much more, I think, knowledgeable about the subject. So there's lots of arguments that I would kind of deepen and complexify. I was a little too much in love with the the kind of power of policing back then. I'm less so now, or at least I have a different conclusion about it now. Um, but yeah, I mean, in the same way that how many things that you believed in the year 2000 do you believe in today?
Gosh, I don't even remember anything. I mean, I was 20, so my thinking was relatively unsophisticated back then. Not all of us are Malcolm Gladwell and with a starting off with a bang in life. So I don't know. Probably not a whole lot. I probably look back and go, "Good God, that's cringe," and I'm glad it's not on the internet.
Yeah. Well, I feel the same way, like about some way. It's stuff I wrote when I was in my 30s. Why would I?
Yeah.
There's no reason to assume that I'm gonna agree with that stuff today.
What's this I hear about you taking hiring a pilot to take you on a spiral dive just to see what it feels like so you could describe the feeling? That's really going to the next level. I'm proud of my prep for this show. That is really the next level in terms of prep and research to write a paragraph.
Years ago, I wrote an article for the New Yorker about. Remember when John F. Kennedy Jr. crashed his plane? And I
Sure.
wanted to understand. I wrote an article on the difference between choking and panicking, and how they are profoundly different kinds of failure. And I wanted to describe. My argument was that um, what John F. Kennedy Jr. went through was, hold on, was he choking or panicking? I can't even remember. I had this long, complicated. Anyway, the point was, in order to describe how he failed, I had to understand what happened to him. And so we know what happened to his plane. It went into a spiral dive, and a spiral dive is when um, your plane starts to kind of twist around and around and around, faster and faster and faster. And the weird thing is, and it's really hard to explain to someone who, this is why I went on this spiral dive. When you're in the middle of a spiral dive, you don't know you're spiral diving. It feels normal. So the plane can be spinning around and around in the air, but if you're inside the plane and you can't, particularly if it's dark, if you can't see the horizon and see how you're spinning, it will feel normal. So John F. Kennedy Jr. crashes his plane into the Atlantic in a spiral dive. He would not have been aware that his plane was headed into the water until it hit the water. And I was like, that's really weird. I want to feel what that's like. So I got a pilot, the great writer, uh, Longavisha. Is it Bill Longavisha, who writes for the Atlantic? He was also a big pilot. And I said, will you take me up in your plane? I'll buy the gas. And he's like, sure. So, and will you take me in a spiral dive? I will totally take you. So we went in a spiral dive, and then the last moment, we're like spiraling and we're heading into this is over in the San Francisco Bay. And at the very last moment, he pulls out of the dive and we feel the G forces. And I'm like, how much longer, how close were we to like crashing the plane? He was like, oh, about a second.
No, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. That sounds like he's messing with you. That's too close for comfort.
I think he was messing with me.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he knew what he was doing. I think he
Ugh.
was saying we were about a second from being potentially in trouble. Because, eventually what happens is the G forces become such on the plane that it will often just break up in midair.
Oh my gosh.
It's because the stresses on as the plane goes round and round and faster and faster. But I did verify that you can be in a plane that is spinning around and around and around, and you are completely unaware.
I just I understand the impulse to want to check that because I can't really imagine. I'd like to think when I go on a roller coaster and it's twisting me around in a corkscrew, I'm very aware that I'm twisting around in a corkscrew. So I don't understand how I could be in a plane going much faster than a roller coaster and just not notice. So I
Yeah,
guess I understand
I had to.
that.
People were telling me this, and I was like, I don't believe you. I don't
Yeah.
understand that. So that's why I had to do it. It was really fun. I don't have. I was in the hands of an experienced pilot. I didn't think I was, taking any great risks.
I just didn't figure you for the daredevil type, you know?
Well, I don't have. I mean, I'm rational about these kinds of things.
Mhm.
So would I've gone and flown across the Atlantic at dusk with John F. Kennedy Jr.? No, I'm not getting into a plane with a rookie pilot. But I chose a guy who's like a guy with 30 years of flying under his belt. So, that's their. I calibrate my risks. I'm not a daredevil. I don't ski. I don't ride a motorcycle in the rain.
Mm. In the rain, but you do ride otherwise.
Uh, I have on a couple occasions. It's too much fun. It's too dangerous. It's like you're right. You're like this is like it should be illegal, and I'm going to kill myself because it's so cooler heads prevail after
Yeah.
10 minutes on a bike.
You've got quite an analytical mind, I suppose. I don't know if maybe that's not quite the right term, but do you ever think your life would have been easier if you thought less about things?
Not easier. I don't know. That's interesting. Uh, it wouldn't have been as fun. I mean, I find kind of solving the writing puzzles and learning new things just to be an enormously pleasurable activity. So um, it's hard to imagine my life would be easier without that source of pleasure. It sounds like my life would be dull, which would be harder, right?
I suppose. I get. I guess not tortured by your thinking. I suppose it must have gotten you in trouble. The thing that makes you who you are in terms of your body of work must also have gotten you in trouble at least once or twice in your life.
Ah, I'm not sure that's true. I'm trying to think. I mean, I was a very mildly rebellious teenager, but not not in any. I always rebelled in very kind of, we would our when I was in high school, our principal, who we liked, was transferred, and so we arranged a protest on City Hall. But it was all tongue in cheek. I mean, we bussed half the school 20 miles to City Hall, and we made big banners, and we gave these incendiary speeches, and but it was all like, it was harmless, kind of. It wasn't real serious transgression. So I'm not a seriously transgressive person. I'm more mischievous than I am transgressive.
That must have been quite the compliment to that principal. I assume that'll put a smile on your face for a few months when your students bus 20 miles and give these,
I'll tell you,
fiery.
he knew that we were about to do it and didn't stop us.
Yeah,
We loaded 300, 400 students onto school buses, took them in the middle of the day, like took in the middle of a school day, took
right.
them 20 miles and marched on City Hall without getting no parents were consulted, or it just like it could never happen today, of course, but it was a triumph of social engineering, I think, more than it was.
I mean, that's definitely not the typical kind of teenage rebellion. That's very on brand for you, I think, though, right? Have organized a protest about something that's all tongue in cheek, as opposed to like stealing a car and going for a joyride. I feel like it's very on brand for you.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was on brand. And the we made these giant posters, these plaque that people carried. One of them, the guy's name was Milliken. Hell no, Milliken won't go. Because remember, this is the '70s, so like the Vietnam War is still like in the air. We had just read Macbeth, and so the school board president was called Lynn Wollstonecraft, and one of the big banners was Wollstonecraft, bloody sceptered tyrant. And then it was like that. That was the spirit of it. It was
at least at that point, the board must go. At least they're reading the classics, right? This. Maybe we shouldn't have transferred the guy. Look how educated and literate and cultured these kids are under his guidance,
they
right?
transferred them. They transferred them.
Yeah.
But I think they got a chuckle. They got a chuckle.
I heard you never budge on the title of a book or a podcast or something like that once you come up with it. Why? What's going on there?
Is that true?
You said that in your master class. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. I do pride myself on titles. And uh, the thing that disappoints me most about podcast episodes is when I feel like the title doesn't do the episode justice.
Hmm.
And so it is something I take seriously. And I'm usually very collaborative and, very open to other ideas. But I think it's probably true that I'm, I can be quite firm that this is the right. I think it's because, titles are hugely, hugely important, massively under. There are books that I swear have been successes 100% because they have brilliant titles.
Hmm.
I mean, not because the book itself is bad, but there are many great books that. A better way of saying it is there's a universe of great books that fail because they have a lousy title. So the choice of title is enormously kind of uh, central in explaining whether something makes it or doesn't. And yet people seem they're very casual about it. They like come up with titles at the last moment. They say, oh, we're going to press and I got a week to figure out what my title is. I'm like, dude, a week? Are you kidding me? You should have been thinking about your title when you started the book.
Oh man. I'm getting anxiety thinking about having to think of a title the week before the book publishes. And I mean, look, as you can imagine, not a lot of time was spent thinking about the title of this particular show, right? The Jordan Harbinger show.
No, but
And
that's it's the right title, right?
is
Because
it?
it is because you understood something intuitively about the medium, which is the medium is incredibly personal, and that the reason people are tuning in is you, right? You are their chosen filter for all of this stuff. So it is, in fact, exactly your title is exactly the same way that Joe Rogan's podcast has got to be called Joe Rogan. He is the filter. He's the reason we want to see the world through his eyes. That's why we listen. So calling it something else would I think would be an act of would needlessly overthink uh, the kind of problem. You did it exactly right.
Ah, well, that's good to hear because, of course, I was going to say, hey, if I was going to rename this podcast, what would the process look like? I guess I can still ask that question. It's just that I might come to the same answer.
Yeah, I would say it sort of has to be you because the question is what do you want from the pod? This is I had this fascinating conversation recently with this guy who's a life coach and who told me that he always begins his discussions with people by asking them what they want, which seems like a really obvious thing to ask. But he says surprising numbers of people can't answer that question. And that always takes them back. You should be able to answer that question. So you should, what do you want from your career? What do you want?
Mhm.
So in this case, if you were to rename your podcast, you would say, well, what do you want this podcast to accomplish? And that should drive your title, right? What do you want what do you want readers to listeners to think when they tune in, or what reasons do you want them to have for deciding to join your kind of community, your listening community? That want question is at the heart um, of all great titles. They satisfy the want question.
It sounds like maybe, and again, maybe I'm reading into this too much. It sounds like when you create the title, you're almost framing the work, right? Maybe it's just I'm really going to butcher this metaphor, I suppose, but you're kind of putting boundaries on what you're going to create or what you are creating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it makes total sense. I think you are framing it, which is why I spend so much time thinking about. The title of my podcast, Revisionist History, was something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. Was not popular among the people when I first ran it by the people I was doing the podcast. They were like, "Really, you want to
Oh,
call
I
it
love
that?"
it. Yeah.
But it does this. It does a very specific thing. What I wanted was I wanted to get people to understand that we were re-examining things, but I also wanted to. The term revisionist history has a kind of disreputable patina,
Right.
and I wanted to reclaim that. I wanted people to understand that this was a mischievous look back. We're doing it's in quotes revision. We're
Mhm.
doing quote unquote revisionist history on this thing. We're going to have fun. We're not doing dry and dusty recaps on something that happened 200 years ago. You know, we're like doing a wild speculation on why Will and Grace is the most important sitcom of the last 25 years. Like that's what we're doing. Like we're retelling the ending of the Little Mermaid. We're not, we have one episode that's all about Akron, Ohio, and in a playful way talking about
Right. I heard that one in the preview that your assistant sent me.
that's the game we're playing. And so the title, the fact that I'm winking at the disreputable reputation of that term is central to what I want people to think about the podcast.
So it seems like if you're framing the work or if you're framing the body of work that you're about to create, or I guess, yeah, putting a frame or boundaries on what you're creating, that would be a big advantage, right? Because anything that falls outside of it, you can cut it and put it back in the mental drawer of things to use somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of you do need sort of methods of organizing your thinking. Years ago, I used to always say um, that most people are experience rich and theory poor, which is a way of saying that what we lack are methods of organizing our experiences. And I'm big on those kinds of organizing principles, and a title is an organizing principle.
Mhm.
It just reminds you, what path you've set out on, and beginning with it. If you can start any creative project with the title, you are so far ahead of the game. It's it's amazing.
Well, I think I'm glad that I accidentally got the name of the show right. I do wish I'd had this conversation before having to name the show, but hey, before I rename the show, I'm gonna call you. Uh, but thank you once again for doing the show. I know I didn't let you off easy today with some of the questions, but always good to see you. And season 7 of revisionist history is coming out. Well, probably out by the time you're listening to this, so make sure you go grab it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.